Hello and welcome. Tonight, we'll drift gently into the dusty, dim-lit saloons of the Wild West, where boots scuffed across wooden floors, lanterns swayed above card tables, and barkeeps poured drinks strong enough to curl your toes. But tonight, we're not here for the gunfights or the gambling. No, we're here for the food. The strange, surprising, often unsettling things that were served behind swinging doors, scraped from stew pots, or spooned into chipped bowls after midnight. If you enjoy quiet journeys into forgotten places and the soft, strange corners of real history, you're warmly invited to subscribe or simply stay and listen. And if you'd like, let me know where you're listening from. It's comforting to imagine us all falling asleep together, stretched across the miles, sharing stories in the hush of the night. Now, let your breath slow. Let the noise of the day melt away, and come with me into the kitchens and back rooms of the Wild West saloons, where nothing on the menu was quite what it seemed. What if I told you there was a stew in the Wild West that never ended? A pot that kept bubbling day after day, night after night, with new ingredients tossed in as old ones disappeared, and no one knew exactly what was in it. Because for many saloons, the house stew wasn't just a meal. It was a living legend, one that simmered endlessly in a corner of the kitchen, its flavors deepening not just from spice, but from time itself. It started early. Before the doors opened, someone would stoke the fire, lift the iron lid, and give the pot a stir. It had simmered overnight, of course, because you didn't stop the stew, not ever. You just added to it. A bit of last night's beef, a handful of beans, a scoop of whatever the trapper left behind. Rabbit, raccoon, goat? No one asked. No one really wanted to know. They called it slumgullion, a name that sounded like something scraped off the bottom of a barrel, because it often was. Whatever couldn't be sold, whatever was close to turning, whatever the barkeep found in the back bin, it went in. Potatoes, onions, wild carrots, dried apples, lard, even coffee grounds. Some cooks swore by a dash of whiskey. Others claimed a splash of vinegar was the trick. No two pots tasted the same, even on the same day. And still, people ate it, night after night, because it was hot, because it was cheap, because when the wind howled and the whiskey ran low, a tin cup of something salty and steaming was worth more than gold. But what made the stew so infamous wasn't the flavor. It was the mystery. You might bite into something tender and rich, or something chewy and unidentifiable. Bones turned up in bowls. A tooth once. A bootlace, according to rumor. But the barkeep just shrugged. Adds texture, he'd say. Still, folks lined up. Ranch hands, drifters, miners. All hunched over wooden counters, slurping the same stew that had been cooking since before the war. Some said if you added enough pepper, you couldn't taste the squirrel. Others said the squirrel was the best part. And somehow the stew earned a kind of respect, a reputation. It was the heart of the saloon, bubbling in the back room, feeding the hungry and daring the brave. You could sit down with strangers, share a bowl, and know you'd eaten the same thing cowboys had eaten a decade ago. Maybe even the same ladleful. Because in those saloons, meals weren't meals. They were survival, and sometimes they were stories. But if you think the stew was strange, wait until you hear what they served in the morning. A breakfast that could knock you flat, clear your sinuses, or confuse you entirely. We'll rise with the sun and sip what they called coffee, chew on salt bacon, and try not to gag at what passed for eggs. Breakfast in a shot glass, coffee you could chew, eggs you shouldn't trust, and the bacon that bit back. What if I told you that breakfast in a Wild West saloon was less a meal and more a dare? That the first meal of the day could be strong enough to wake the dead, weird enough to question reality, and greasy enough to keep your arteries warm through a Montana snowstorm. because what passed for breakfast back then wasn't what we'd recognize now. And that was just the coffee. Let's begin there, the coffee. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't subtle, and it wasn't ever served in a ceramic mug with fancy froth on top. This was coffee boiled to a black sludge in a pot that hadn't been washed since the previous century. The grounds were never strained. They simply sank, or floated, or clung to your teeth. You didn't sip it, you braced for it. Some men swore you could patch a boot with a cup of saloon coffee. Others used it to remove rust. Barkeep coffee was often made from the last dregs of the bean barrel, mixed with burnt rye, scorched chicory root, or even ground up acorns to stretch it farther. In mining towns where real coffee beans were rare, saloons got creative. One morning, blend included soot scraped from the stovepipe, added for depth. Another used crushed corn husks. No one complained. Not because they liked it, but because they needed it. It was hot, it was bitter, it was fuel. And for men coming off all-night poker games, or women who'd spent hours on their feet serving drinks to cowhands with more whiskey than manners, that bitter mud in a tin cup was salvation. Now, the eggs. If there were eggs were precious in the Wild West. Real, fresh chicken eggs were a luxury in the high desert, and saloon keepers knew it. So they faked it. Some saloons served powdered eggs, reconstituted with water and fried until they resembled yellow rubber. Others used pigeon eggs, turtle eggs, or whatever was found that day in the coop. Once, even rattlesnake eggs. It depended on the town, the season, and whether or not anyone could tell the difference. If they served scrambled eggs, they were often overcooked until dry as saddle leather, or undercooked and terrifying. One barkeep proudly served whiskey eggs, which meant he fried them in a splash of whatever was left in the bottle. It didn't help the flavor, but it distracted from it. And then the bacon. Salt pork was the closest thing to it. Not bacon in the way we know it, but thick slabs of fatty meat preserved in barrels of salt, stacked in cellars and retrieved with tongs. Before frying, it had to be soaked or boiled, sometimes both, just to make it chewable. Some saloons skipped that step entirely. You could tell which ones by the way the bacon shattered when bitten, like meat glass. Still, it was protein, it was meat, it was breakfast, and people ate it. You might get your bacon with a hunk of bread, hard as a hoof, toasted if the fire was hot enough, or a spoonful of lard mashed with molasses, which passed as spread. If you were lucky, there might be beans. If you were really lucky, there might be hotcakes, flat, leathery things fried on cast iron, often tasting of last night's onions. Syrup, rare, butter, dream on. And yet, despite the grit and grease, people looked forward to it. Because it was warm, because it was familiar, because it meant you'd made it through another night. Saloons became breakfast stops as much as drink dens. Miners came before sunrise. Ranchers came before the horses stirred. Women brought their children in for a slice of bread and a shared tin of eggs, if they had the coins. Breakfast in a saloon wasn't refined, but it was a ceremony, a ritual, something to cut the hunger before the long road ahead. And some say the best stories were told over that gritty morning meal, the real kind, before the day put its mask on. A gambler and a preacher sharing beans, a sheriff and a cattle rustler passing the same salt tin. Morning was a leveler, and saloons for a few hours became a place where everyone just needed warmth. But if you think breakfast was tough, just wait until we sit down for dinner. We'll open the doors to the evening menu. Fried oysters from nowhere near the ocean, pickled pig's feet served in beer glasses, and pies filled with whatever wasn't nailed down. Dinner that fought back. Oysters on dusty plates, pickled pig's feet, and the pie that lied. What if I told you dinner in a Wild West saloon was part survival, part surprise, and often part science experiment. That your plate might arrive with something cold in the center, bubbling at the edges, or still twitching from whatever brine it had been pulled from. Because in the low light of a flickering lantern, after a long ride and a longer drink, almost anything could look like supper. And sometimes it had to be. Let's start with the oysters. Yes, oysters in the middle of Nevada, or Kansas, or Montana. They were shipped in barrels packed with ice and sawdust, hauled across miles of prairie by rail, mule, or pure stubbornness. By the time they arrived, if they arrived, they smelled like memory and tasted like regret. But they were exotic, decadent, a way to show off. "Oysters tonight," the barkeep might announce, standing proud with his thumb in his belt like he'd just landed a whale. Never mind that the ice was half melted and the oysters were sloshing around like a biology lesson. They'd be shucked with a pocket knife, served raw or fried in week-old grease, and washed down with rot-gut whiskey strong enough to disinfect anything it touched. You didn't eat them for the flavor. You ate them for the story. And then there were the pickled things. Pig's feet in particular, salty, rubbery, suspended in cloudy jars like disembodied ghosts. They were served with toothpicks or fingers, pulled out by barkeeps who didn't flinch at the sight of toenails. The feet were cheap and lasted forever, which made them perfect saloon fare. "You want meat or vinegar?" was a real question. Sometimes the answer was both. Men with iron stomachs gnawed the joints in silence. Some swore by it. "Good for the bones," they said, or "keeps the gout down." Others just liked the ritual of chewing something tougher than their own boots. The evening menu might also feature whatever was on hand: squirrel stew, cow tongue sandwiches, possum hash, or jackrabbit pie. Ah yes, the pie. Pie in the Wild West was interpretive. You couldn't trust the word on the chalkboard. Apple could mean dried apple bits soaked in whiskey and mashed with biscuit crumbs. Berry could mean gooseberries if you were lucky, or buttons and red ink if you weren't. Some pies were savory, stuffed with stringy meat, black beans, and onions fried until they surrendered. Others were sweet, kind of, if you counted molasses drizzled over old cornmeal. But the crusts were legend. Thick as roofing tile, flaky as the barkeep's promises. One woman famously baked her crust with sand in it, to stretch the flour, she said. The sheriff broke a tooth. He still came back the next night. And if you didn't want pie, well, there was always beans. Always. Beans were the reliable friend of the frontier menu. Baked, boiled, fried, refried, salted or mushed into oblivion. You could find them next to everything: eggs, bacon, tongue, pickles, oysters. Beans didn't ask questions, beans didn't go bad, beans just were. And every now and then something special appeared. Fried trout pulled from a nearby stream. Elk roasted slow over applewood. Cornbread so fresh you could still taste the fire. These were the moments that reminded people what food could be. Simple, honest, made by hand and shared with strangers. When those meals came, saloons fell quiet. Men took off their hats. Women smiled over their spoons. And for a few slow, dusty minutes, the frontier tasted like home. But of course, not all meals were eaten at tables. We'll leave the comfort of the saloon behind and follow those who ate by campfire, from tin plates under the stars, with nothing but beans, bullets, and burnt bread to get them through the night. Tin plates and burnt bread, what cowboys ate under the stars. What if I told you the best meals in the Wild West weren't served in saloons at all, but out in the open, with coyotes howling nearby and smoke curling up into a moonlit sky? That some of the most memorable bites of food were scraped from the bottom of a blackened pot, eaten by firelight, and shared by men too tired to care what they were chewing. Because in the world of chuck wagons and cattle drives, food wasn't about flavor. It was about fuel, and the fire was the only waiter. Cowboys didn't dine, they fed, quickly, quietly, and often standing up. At the center of it all was the chuck wagon, a rolling pantry, kitchen, and supply closet, often driven by the grumpiest, most essential man on the trail, the cook. Called Cookie, Beans, or occasionally worse, he ruled over his domain like a frontier king, armed with a long spoon, a sharper tongue, and an uncanny ability to make meals out of almost nothing. Breakfast came before dawn. Coffee was first, always, strong, black, and thick enough to chew. The pot never truly emptied, just like in the saloons. Grounds from yesterday mixed with whatever today offered. Some chuck wagon cooks dropped eggshells or crushed charcoal into the pot to settle the grounds. Others just let nature take its course. Then came the beans. Always the beans. Pinto, black, or navy, whatever dried bag had lasted through the trail. They were soaked overnight, boiled over the fire, and seasoned with salt pork, bacon scraps, or leftover grease. There was no subtlety, no spice rack, just salt, pepper if you were lucky, and the hope that no pebbles snuck in with the legumes. A chipped ladle full of beans on a tin plate was breakfast, lunch, and sometimes supper. Alongside the beans, biscuits, or, more accurately, something that used to be biscuits before being burnt, flattened, and stacked like bricks. Cooked in a Dutch oven buried in coals, or in an iron skillet over open flame, these biscuits were hard enough to survive a stampede. Cowboy toothbreakers, they were called. Others named them prairie shingles. But when soaked in bacon grease or molasses, if you had any, they became soft enough to chew, sort of. Supper often included son-of-a-gun stew, a cowboy concoction of mystery meat, beans, onions, and anything left over from the day before. You didn't ask what kind of meat. You didn't want to know. Some said rabbit. Others whispered jackal. One cook claimed he used snake once, just for fun. Still, it filled your belly, and when you'd been in the saddle for 12 hours, sore to your bones and sunburnt from crown to collar, hot stew in a tin plate was the closest thing to comfort you'd find. And then there was sourdough, the pride of any good trail cook. A bubbling jar of starter passed from wagon to wagon, protected like a newborn. It smelled like feet. It tasted like heaven, or at least like something that hadn't been burnt. Pancakes, biscuits, bread. If you had sourdough, you had something to look forward to. Dessert? Only if Cookie was in a good mood, or if someone found berries along the trail. Then maybe a cobbler, cooked in a black pot with a crust that was more dough than cake, but sweet just the same. Or dried apples boiled with sugar, thickened into a paste and spread on biscuits. Small comforts. Big memories. And it wasn't just about the food, it was the moment. Campfires flickering, boots kicked off. The long silence of the prairie broken only by the hiss of the kettle and the murmur of tired men. They didn't talk much, but sometimes they sang. Old songs, passed down from places they barely remembered. Songs about rivers, mothers, horses lost, and loves left behind. The food was never fancy, but it was honest. And after dinner came the best part. Lying back on a saddle blanket, belly full, stars above, and the wind cool on your face. You'd drift off listening to coyotes cry in the distance. Maybe a harmonica low and lonesome in the dark. Because for cowboys, that was enough. Beans, biscuits, and a sky full of stars. But not every meal under the stars was shared in peace. Some were eaten with one hand on a gun, some were stolen. Some were strange beyond belief. We'll dig into the weirdest things people ate in the Wild West, from roasted prairie dog and lizard on a stick to toasted grasshoppers and soup made from bones no one could quite identify. Prairie dog, stew, and lizard on a stick. The strangest things they actually ate. What if I told you that some Wild West meals didn't just push the limits of taste, they left taste behind entirely? That when hunger hit hard enough, people turned to creatures, critters, and concoctions you'd never expect to see on a plate. Because when the pantry was empty and the trail long, the frontier made one thing clear. If it moved, it might be food. Let's begin with the humble prairie dog. Small, furry, curious, and absolutely edible. Prairie dog stew was surprisingly common in places where game was scarce. Trappers and travelers would shoot a few, skin them quickly, and toss the meat into the pot. Tastes like rabbit, they'd say, but only if you didn't think too hard about the tail. It was boiled with onions, if you had them, or with wild sage and a pinch of salt. The meat was lean, slightly gamey, but filling. And that was enough. Next, lizard on a stick. Yes, really. In the hottest parts of the Southwest, especially in dry stretches where deer and rabbit were rare, locals got creative. Skinned, skewered, and roasted over fire, lizards were fast food before there was fast food. Crisp skin, stringy meat. You had to eat it quick before the heat turned it to leather. But they were everywhere, and they didn't fight back too much. Grasshoppers were fair game too, toasted until crunchy, then seasoned with salt or dipped in honey if you had any. Kids sometimes ate them for fun. Adults ate them when they had to. Some saloons even served them as a dare snack, tossed into bowls on poker nights. You ate one, you got a free shot if you didn't throw it back up first. Rattlesnake was another delicacy, especially out where cattle were few and danger was plenty. Skinned and coiled like a rope in the pan, it was cooked slowly with butter or grease, if you had it, and cut into chunks. Tastes like chicken, people said, because everything weird did. But snake meat had its own chew, its own heat. You earned your meal when you cooked a snake. First, you had to kill it. Then, you had to make sure it was really dead. Then, you had to skin it before rigor mortis set in. Not exactly fast food. Desperate times brought even stranger meals. There are recorded stories of Wild West towns resorting to boiled leather shoes, soaked for hours, softened, and eaten like jerky. Bark was chewed for sap. Tree roots were boiled. One man famously survived a blizzard by eating candles. Another lived 3 days on flour mixed with creek water and fried into pancakes he called hunger cakes. And sometimes the weird meals were luxury, if you had the coin. Mock turtle soup, made without any turtle at all, was a hit in fancy saloons. They used calf's head, tongue, and brains, boiled and mashed until they mimicked the gelatinous texture of turtle meat. Add some wine, cloves, and lemon peel, and you had a dish that confused the senses and tested the stomach. Some cooked with blood pudding, blood soup, blood sausages, passed down from European traditions and kept alive in dusty kitchens. Not for the faint-hearted, but full of iron and calories. And then there was hardtack. Hardtack deserves its own chapter, but here's a taste. Flour, water, salt, baked until it resembled a brick, eaten for years, literally. Some soldiers from the Civil War still had pieces tucked in their packs when they headed west. If you were lucky, you had teeth strong enough to crack it. If not, you soaked it in stew until it gave up. Was it good? No. Was it food? Technically. Meals like these weren't about pleasure. They were about persistence. The Wild West didn't reward picky eaters. It fed the hungry with whatever crawled, slithered, flew, or waited too long to run. And those who learned to stomach it? They lived to tell the tale, often with a joke, a grin, or a scar to prove it. But food wasn't always eaten for survival. Sometimes it was for show, for trickery, for persuasion. We'll step into the world of traveling peddlers, miracle tonics, and saloon scams, where fake food, false cures, and mysterious elixirs filled bellies, emptied pockets, and left more than a few folks wondering what they'd actually just swallowed. Snake oil and swindled suppers. The strange world of saloon scams and miracle meals. What if I told you the most dangerous thing on a Wild West saloon menu wasn't the stew or the rattlesnake, but the bottle of miracle tonic behind the bar? That the real trick wasn't swallowing a mouthful of pickled eggs, but spotting the lie before it swallowed your last dollar. Because in the Wild West, food and drink weren't always what they seemed, and saloons, those rowdy, creaky watering holes of laughter and danger, were often a stage for some of the cleverest cons the West ever saw. Picture this. A man walks into a town dusty from travel, coat just a little too clean, voice just a little too polished. He stands tall on a crate outside the saloon and shouts to the crowd, "Gentlemen, ladies, children, and dogs, I bring you the miracle cure of the modern age. One sip and you'll never limp again, never cough again, never cry again. For one shiny coin you can taste the future." Snake oil, they called it. Not always made from snakes, but always sold with a grin. Bottled in amber glass, often smelling of turpentine, these tonics were a staple behind many saloon counters. Some were made from castor oil, alcohol, opium, and camphor. Others included cocaine, morphine, chloroform, and even mercury. Yes, mercury. And were guaranteed to cure anything from a bad back to a broken heart. You didn't drink these because they tasted good. You drank them because someone convinced you they could make you whole again. A few drops in your whiskey, a swig straight from the bottle, or a spoonful stirred into your coffee, and suddenly the world blurred just enough for your pain to fade. Temporarily, at least. Saloon owners loved this. It kept customers coming back, and not just for drinks. A man who limped in with a cough and left swaying with a smile was good for business. Testimonials were staged. Local men, who arrived with the peddler, would shout, "It fixed my hip," or "My wife started talking to me again." And people believed them because hope in the Wild West was rare and precious. But the scams didn't end with medicine. Some saloons served beef that wasn't. Pork, raccoon, or even dog could be passed off as steak if you chopped it small enough and fried it in onions. If the customer complained, the cook might just pour a shot of vinegar over it and call it cowboy marinade. In more remote towns, meat arrived in barrels soaked in brine. And if the label peeled off, well, a guess was as good as the truth. There were reports of boiled boot leather disguised as jerky, stretched and spiced until chewable. Rat was rumored to be served in pies. Pigeon passed as quail, goat as lamb. Some menus listed wild game stew, a term so vague it could mean rabbit, squirrel, or something that had just wandered in that morning. And then there were drinks. You might think you were ordering whiskey, but the bottle could be filled with wood alcohol, kerosene, or a mix of tobacco juice and molasses. Some barkeeps watered their liquor with ditch water, river water, or rain scraped off the roof. Others colored their moonshine with burnt sugar or soot to mimic the amber hue of real spirits. And the labels? Reused, repurposed, or invented entirely. One famous hoax involved Parisian absinthe, which turned out to be stale gin with green dye and licorice root. It made men hallucinate, but not from the wormwood, from the paint thinner. Even the humble beer wasn't safe. A keg could be half sour before anyone noticed. And if you complained, the barkeep would say, "That's how they like it in St. Louis," even if he'd never been to Missouri. Still, for every scam, there was a crowd ready to fall for it. Because the West was built on risk, on belief, on the roll of the dice, and the glint of a promise too good to ignore. And when the stew was hot, the tonic was strong, and the lies were well told. No one wanted to look too closely. There were even stories of professional eaters, conmen hired to sit in saloons and order the weirdest things on the menu, chewing them with exaggerated delight to encourage others. That blood sausage? Best thing I ever had. You haven't lived until you've had boiled badger tail. Truth? Maybe not. But in the flickering lamplight, with a belly full of rot gut and laughter in the rafters, sometimes the performance was the point. And the barkeeps, oh, the barkeeps knew. They were half performer, half priest. They heard every secret, saw every trick, and decided when to play dumb and when to pour another drink. Some took pity, others leaned into the hustle, but all knew that food and drink were more than nourishment out there. They were theater, because sometimes in the Wild West the only way to swallow the truth was to wash it down with a good lie. But not all meals were served in crowded saloons. Some were whispered over wedding tables, quiet breakfasts between lovers, or hurried bites before someone said goodbye forever. We'll step into the most intimate meals of the Wild West, the food of weddings, funerals, love letters, and last chances, where every bite was a memory and every flavor had a name: love, loss, and leftovers, the most intimate meals of the Wild West. What if I told you the Wild West wasn't all gunfights and gristle? That beneath the grit and smoke and swinging saloon doors were quiet tables, soft words, and meals that meant more than meat and beans ever could. Because not every meal was loud. Not every bite was survival. Some were moments of tenderness, tiny ceremonies that left behind echoes long after the plates were cleared. Let's start with a wedding table. Out on the frontier, weddings were rarely grand, but they were sacred. A sheet hung between trees, a borrowed dress, a preacher who doubled as a barber. But the food, that was where people showed love. Every neighbor brought something. The last jar of peach preserves, a loaf of bread from scratch, a smoked ham saved for just this occasion. There was no menu, only memory. Corn dodgers fried crisp, biscuits smeared with sweet molasses, maybe a pot of greens with ham hock, or stewed apples spiced with cinnamon bark and prairie honey. If you were truly lucky, someone brought a pie, apple, rhubarb, or wild berry, the crust flaking like soft earth. And maybe there was cake, dry cornbread baked with a few stolen sugar cubes to make it special. The couple would share a plate. One bite for her, one bite for him. The townsfolk would sing, laugh, and pass tin cups full of cider or watered-down whiskey. And for a little while, the world outside faded. Just two hands clasped, and the taste of hope on everyone's tongue. But not all special meals celebrated new beginnings. Some marked the end. A funeral meal in the West wasn't always solemn. It was a tradition, a duty. Neighbors arrived bearing heavy dishes, more than anyone could eat, because cooking meant you cared. A slab of cold beef, pickled onions, salt-rising bread, collards with bacon. Everyone ate. Everyone remembered. Stories passed between bites. He once roped a bull with a broken arm. She taught every kid in town to spell their name. And there was always coffee, black and bitter, poured thick into mugs without handles. Drunk slow or quick, depending on the ache. The widowed, the grieving, they often ate little, but the food was there. Waiting, in silence, on chipped plates beside empty chairs, because food said what words couldn't. And then there were the meals shared in love and in secrecy. A fried egg sandwich slipped to a ranch hand before dawn, with fingers lingering just a second too long. A warm biscuit left beside a bunkhouse cot, no note, just a smile drawn in jam. Courting on the frontier wasn't all roses and poems. It was cinnamon, if you could get it. Lard pie crusts that didn't fall apart. A small bottle of blackberry wine poured behind the barn under stars. There are stories of women who baked cornbread for one cowboy and hardtack for the rest. Of a man who rode 50 miles just to bring a jar of honey to the girl who liked it in her tea. Of quiet breakfasts shared before the others woke, soft boiled eggs, a slice of apple, 2 spoons and 1 bowl of oatmeal. And sometimes, meals were goodbyes. The last dinner before a man rode out to war, to danger, to disappear. The final cup of stew before the posse left at dawn. Food didn't have to be fancy to mean something. It just had to be shared. A woman stirring soup slower than needed, just to stay close. A father offering half his biscuit to the son, too nervous to eat. A friend handing over the last pickle from the jar. No words, just a nod. Even criminals, even condemned men, were given a final meal. It wasn't always generous, but it was offered. Because on the edge of everything, food reminded people they were still human, that they were seen, that someone, even a stranger, cared enough to feed them before the light went out. These weren't meals people talked about. They didn't go in recipe books or saloon menus, but they stayed in the memory, in the way a smell could break a heart or warm a spine. Even decades later, old cowboys would tear up at the scent of lard frying in an iron pan. Just like she made, they'd whisper, and they'd be quiet the rest of the day. Because the Wild West wasn't built on bullets. It was built on hunger, and the ways people fed one another through joy, grief, longing, and loss. But there was one kind of hunger that twisted even deeper, the hunger not of the body, but of the soul. We'll explore the spiritual side of Wild West meals, the blessings, superstitions, and secret rituals that turned even the simplest stew into something sacred. Supper and superstition, when food was more than just a meal. What if I told you that in the Wild West, food was never just food? That every spoonful had a shadow, every loaf a legend, and every table a whisper of something deeper. Because beyond the smoke and grit, behind the whiskey breath and rifle clicks, there lived something older, a quiet belief that what you ate, how you ate, and when you ate could change your fate. People on the frontier didn't just bless their meals out of habit. They whispered thanks like they were bargaining with the sky. Because when land could turn against you, when the harvest failed or the trail was long, food became a sacred exchange between body and soul, between luck and the unknown. Before every meal, no matter how humble, many folks bowed their heads, not just to thank God, but to plead for more. For one more harvest, one more healthy calf, one more storm to pass them by. A tin plate of beans and corn dodgers wasn't much, but to someone who'd lost a crop to hail, it might as well have been gold. That gratitude settled over tables like smoke, thick and silent. Some said prayers in Latin, passed down from old country grandparents. Others mumbled words remembered more by rhythm than meaning. Bless this food, bless this day, keep the devil far away. It didn't matter how rough their hands or hard their lives. When the food was laid out, people slowed. Even the hungriest cowboy paused a beat before digging in. It wasn't manners, it was reverence. But not every ritual was holy. Superstition wove itself into every crust of bread and slice of pie. You never cut a pie with a dull knife. It was bad luck for the house. You never passed salt directly hand to hand. Always set it on the table first. Or you'd argue before sundown. Spilling pepper meant a visitor was coming. Breaking bread the wrong way could invite a curse. If a biscuit split perfectly in half without crumbling, it meant good news. If it fell apart in your lap, someone in the family would soon fall ill. These weren't just sayings. They were gospel to many. not because they were logical, but because they gave shape to the chaos of prairie life. In some communities, people tied bits of cloth to trees near their fields, small offerings to ensure a strong harvest. Others buried a coin beneath the doorstep before every big meal, believing it would invite prosperity and keep hunger from returning. The coin was never spent. It was an anchor, a promise, and even if the house burned down, they'd dig it back up and plant it again. Some foods themselves were sacred. Cornbread was more than cornbread. It was a symbol of survival. It had fed people through war, drought, plague, and exile. In some towns, it was considered bad luck to cut cornbread with a knife at all. You tore it, shared it, never divided it like meat, because tearing it kept it whole in spirit, even as you gave it away. Beans were for the poor, yes, but also the blessed. A pot of beans that never emptied meant a home that never lacked. There were stories of women who swore their pot fed 10 mouths a day, even when they only had enough for 2. They called it God's portion. Whether by faith or frugality, it worked. And then there were the ghost plates. Some folks, especially among the older women, would set out an extra plate at dinner, not for guests, for spirits. Maybe it was a child who'd passed the year before, a husband who never came home from the war, a mother long buried back east. That plate wasn't eaten from, but it was always full, a little bread, a ladle of stew, a pinch of salt. So they don't go hungry on the other side, they'd say. Or quietly, so they know we remember. It was part mourning, part hope, and no one questioned it. Even the roughest cowhands tipped their hat at the extra place setting and said nothing. The full moon brought its own food rules. You didn't bake bread on a full moon. It wouldn't rise right. You didn't pour fresh milk on the ground, or you'd offend the spirits. And if you ate meat from an animal killed under a full moon, you'd dream strange dreams. The kind you don't wake up from easy, one old rancher said, staring into a cold cup of coffee. And it wasn't just about what you ate, it was how. Food left unfinished meant something would go unfinished in your life. A meal you refused to share would come back to haunt you, in luck, in love, in health. You never turned away a hungry traveler, not only because it was right, but because it was believed they might be more than they seemed. Angels test you in dusty boots, the saying went. Better feed them just in case. Even the way you stored your food had ritual. Biscuits were wrapped in clean cloth, not just to keep them warm, but to honor the hands that made them. Bread dough was marked with a cross before baking, both to bless it and to help it rise. If a loaf failed, people didn't blame the yeast. They blamed the energy in the room. Arguments spoiled dough. Anger curdled milk. You wanted peace in the kitchen if you wanted your family to eat well. And some foods were saved not for meals, but for meaning. A bit of wedding cake wrapped in paper and hidden in a drawer meant to bring luck when finally eaten months later. A jar of pickled peaches from a child's birthday, opened only on the anniversary of their death. A dried apple tied with ribbon and hung above the hearth, as both ornament and offering. These weren't meals, they were memories, preserved. Food was tied to the land, the weather, the heart. The way the bread rose said something about the week to come. The first taste of the new season's stew told a woman whether her child would stay healthy. The way stew bubbled, fast, slow, angry, could even signal whether a guest would bring good news or bad. These weren't just meals, they were acts of hope, acts of faith, little spells to hold the world together one bite at a time. And in the hush that followed supper, when the fire dimmed and spoons clinked their last echo, people didn't just feel full, they felt held, grounded. Like even out there in the middle of nowhere, something ancient still watched over them. Because to eat in the Wild West wasn't just to feed the body. It was to honor the past, to shield the future, and to whisper to the sky, we are still here. But not all eating happened in safety. Some meals were taken behind locked doors, beneath the floorboards, or while running for your life. We'll sit beside the outcasts and the outlaws, the ones who had to steal or hide their food, whose hunger carried shame, danger, and sometimes freedom, stolen suppers and outlaw appetites, when eating meant risking it all. What if I told you that in the Wild West, hunger could be a crime? That for some, the simple act of eating, finding bread, boiling beans, sneaking a bite of jerky, was something done in shadows, under blankets, or behind the creak of barn doors. Because for every saloon feast and campfire biscuit, there were those who went to bed with an ache in their gut, and those who broke the law just to quiet it. Let's begin with the drifters. They went by many names: hobos, wayfarers, vagrants. Not bandits, not quite, but not trusted either. These were the men who moved from town to town, chasing rumors of work, following the railroad lines and hoping a rancher might need an extra hand. But until they found a job, they were hungry, and hunger doesn't wait politely. They'd slip behind smokehouses and root cellars, pull up radishes from untended gardens, pinch a biscuit cooling on a windowsill if they were fast enough and the dogs didn't bark. Sometimes they asked, a knock at the back door, a tip of the hat, a sheepish smile. Sometimes they didn't, and sometimes they were beaten for it, or worse. Stealing food might earn you a black eye, a stint in the town jail, or a mark against your name that followed you for life. But still, they did it. Not for riches, not for thrills, for warmth, for calories, for one more day. In mining towns, where work was brutal and wages often late, even the honest man might pocket an extra roll or a slab of salt pork from the mess hall. They'd hide it in their shirts, pretend not to chew when the foreman passed. And if they were caught? Maybe just a warning, maybe not. Children, too, learned early how to steal just enough. A crust of bread here, a dried apple there. In the poorer parts of town, they became invisible, darting through alleyways, slipping behind barrels, vanishing before the grown-ups could shout. They're just hungry, some would say. They're trouble, others insisted. And then there were the outlaws, not the ones with $10 bounties and dusty hats, but the ones forced outside the lines of society because of who they were. Women without husbands, immigrants without English, freedmen in towns that still clung to old hatred. These were the folks who couldn't get a table at the saloon or a ration at the church kitchen. So they cooked for each other, quietly, secretly. Behind the brothel, a pot of stew shared among the girls and the boy who swept the floors. Behind the stable, a skillet of cornmeal fried over horse dung and driftwood, stirred by hands calloused from rejection. These meals weren't stolen, they were reclaimed, as if to say, we may not be welcome, but we're still here. We're still eating. Some outlaws, the famous kind, lived in lean-tos and mountain hideouts, surviving on beans, jerky, and whatever game they could shoot. Their food wasn't grand. It was gritty. Stringy rabbit meat cooked over pine. Squirrel roasted whole, fur singed off. Berries scavenged with stained fingers and silent prayer. They drank from creeks, slept on leaves, and cooked over stolen firewood, always listening for hoofbeats behind them. There are stories of Jesse James' gang stopping to cook a meal in the middle of a robbery, looting a homestead, then sitting at the family table to eat the food already set out. They didn't rush. They didn't speak. They simply ate, then left. A warning in the air like smoke, and in the deepest parts of winter, food was more than survival. It was a choice between cold and crime. Some stole from train cars, loaves, sacks of flour, barrels of beans marked for wealthy families back east. Some raided military stores risking bullets for biscuits. They weren't proud of it, but they were alive because of it. Then there were the meals smuggled into jails. A mother sliding bread through iron bars hidden beneath her shawl, a sweetheart tucking apples into a basket of laundry, a child passing beef jerky through the fence to a father who'd rustled cattle but never hurt a soul. These meals were quiet rebellions, tiny acts of love. And sometimes they were the only nourishment a prisoner received. And what of the truly desperate? The ones who ate weeds, roots, and insects, who boiled cloth to make broth, who crushed bones to suck the marrow long after the meat was gone. They existed, often forgotten, often buried without names. But they were the true faces of frontier hunger, and still, they fed each other. A widow with no coin sharing half her onion, a blind man offering his last slice of bread to a stray dog, a starving miner giving his final biscuit to a child with dust on his cheeks and no name on his lips. Because in the Wild West, hunger wasn't just something you felt. It was something you wore, something you shared, something you fought, quietly, fiercely, and often alone. But even in the darkest hunger, even in the loneliest outlaw camp or the coldest barn loft, there remained a ritual. A pause, a bite, a breath, the moment before eating that reminded you, I'm still here, I still exist, I still belong to something. And sometimes, the outlaw, the drifter, the thief, they found kindness. A warm plate offered with no questions. A meal passed through the back door with a wink. A stranger who said, sit, eat. No one should go hungry tonight. Because even on the roughest edge of the frontier, there were those who believed that feeding the hungry, even the outlawed, even the condemned, was sacred. But what happened when hunger met faith? When meals weren't just stolen or earned, but shared around sacred fires and inside dusty wooden chapels? We'll sit beside priests, preachers, and medicine men to explore how the people of the Wild West fed their souls, their tribes, and their beliefs through food, prayer, and quiet sacrifice, communion and cornmeal, feeding the spirit in the Wild West. What if I told you that food in the Wild West was more than hunger, more than habit? That sometimes it was the last thing holding a soul together? That in tiny churches, smoky tents, and sacred circles, meals weren't just eaten. They were prayed over, wept into, and lifted skyward like offerings. Because on the edge of survival, people didn't just crave warmth, they craved meaning. And so they turned to food not only for strength, but for salvation. Let's begin with the churches. Little wooden ones built by hand, plank by plank, rising up from dust like miracles. Inside, the air smelled of pine resin, candle wax, and sometimes stew. Because after the preaching came the eating, and often that's why folks stayed. Potlucks weren't social events. They were lifelines. A place to gather, to remember, to forgive. Tables would sag under the weight of what little people had. A pot of beans, a tin of biscuits, corn pudding, a jug of buttermilk, sometimes fried chicken if someone had managed to spare a bird. No one judged who brought what. One widow might only bring lard pie. A miner might show up empty-handed and leave with full pockets of cornbread wrapped in cloth. That was the gospel. No one left hungry. Not on Sundays. And then there was communion. Grape juice was rare, wine even rarer, so they used what they had. Water with a splash of blackberry jam, apple cider sweetened with honey, biscuits torn small, dry as dust, but passed gently from hand to hand like relics. Some preachers read from Bibles missing pages. Others simply closed their eyes and spoke from memory. But when that broken bread touched your tongue, it didn't matter how far you'd come or how broken you were. For that moment, you belonged. Communion in the Wild West wasn't about ceremony. It was about survival. The souls, not just the bodies. It was one of the few moments in a week when people stopped pretending to be tougher than they were. But not all sacred meals came from churches. On the plains and deserts, in pueblos and lodges, the first people of the land had their own food rituals. Older than guns, older than fences, older than the language the settlers brought. Cornmeal spread in a circle for protection. Fry bread cooked in oil so hot it hissed like wind in the canyon. Deer meat dried and tied in bundles, smoked with mesquite and prayers. The Navajo believed that cornmeal fed the gods as well as the people. It was sprinkled during ceremonies, rubbed on newborns, and placed under the tongue of the dying to guide them home. A spoonful could be an offering, a blessing, a farewell. It was food, yes, but it was also the bridge between the seen and the unseen. The Lakota and Cheyenne feasted not just after battle or harvest, but during vision quests and rites of passage. A bowl of bison stew might be placed at the center of a circle, untouched until the chants ended and the ancestors were honored. Food wasn't consumed. It was shared, with spirits, with sky, with memory. And in the old missions, carved from adobe and stone, Catholic friars blended old world and new. They taught locals to grow wheat and press olives, but also adopted native ingredients, chili, corn, cactus, until their tables were neither European nor indigenous, but something entirely Wild West. Communion wafers were baked beside tortillas. Wine flowed beside chili stew, and each bite was a thread in the fabric of a blended, battered world. Even in the darkest times, people found ways to honor spirit through food. In the prisons and jails, on holidays or sacred nights, inmates might receive a hot biscuit, a spoonful of sweet beans, a peach if it was the season. Guards turned away, heads bowed, not because the law demanded it, but because something deeper did. And on the trail, cowboys carved out their own sacred meals. A lone meal under stars, coffee boiling, beans bubbling, and a piece of bread resting on a saddle might become a kind of worship. They'd speak aloud to no one in particular, to the sky, to God, to mothers they hadn't seen in years. "Thanks for the food," they'd mutter. Or sometimes nothing at all, just a quiet nod, a full belly, and eyes blinking back tears at the firelight. The Wild West was not soft, but it was full of people who clung to softness in their own way, through ritual, through faith, through food. A stew could be a prayer, a pie could be an apology, a biscuit, a promise, and even when the world was cruel, the meal could be kind. There are stories of dying men who asked for just one last spoonful of stew, not to fill them, but to remind them of mothers, of harvests, of simpler days in kitchens lit by lanterns and laughter. That taste, they said, was the only thing strong enough to pull them home. And when children were born, women placed warm cornbread near their beds. So the first thing the baby smelled was food, not fear, not pain, but something good. Because to feed someone, truly feed them, was to say, "You matter," even if no one else said it, even if the world forgot. That bite of food, lovingly made, was proof. You were here, you were worth the effort, you were loved. But in the Wild West, not all food came from kindness. Some meals were poisoned, some drinks were traps, some tables were set with forks and loaded pistols. We'll step into the shadowy world of revenge meals, barroom betrayals, and deadly bites, where one wrong sip could seal a man's fate. Meals with motives, poison, revenge, and deadly bites in the Wild West. What if I told you not every meal in the Wild West was meant to nourish? That some dinners were served with a smile but swallowed with suspicion, because behind the biscuits and beneath the gravy, there might be something far more sinister. In a land where justice was often personal and law arrived too late, food could become a weapon. Quiet, cunning, and final. Let's begin in the saloon. Imagine a poker table. 4 men. Sweat on their brows. Whiskey in their blood. One man's luck is too good. His pile of coins grows like wildfire. The others grow tense. A waitress brings over a bottle. He doesn't notice that this one's uncorked. He doesn't see the powder on the rim of his glass. He drinks, he laughs. And by the time he realizes something's wrong, he's already folding forward into his cards. Poison wasn't just a woman's weapon in the Wild West. It was a patient man's revenge. Arsenic was the most common. Rat poison from the general store, easy to buy, easy to slip into stew, coffee, even a pie. Tasteless, slow, and often untraceable, because out here, death came in many disguises. A woman in Nevada was accused of killing her 3rd husband with rhubarb pie. But it wasn't the rhubarb, it was the leaves ground into the filling. Another man in Kansas died after sipping elderberry wine tainted with laudanum. His rival confessed in a letter, unsigned and left on a church pew. And not all poison came from humans. Bad meat, sour milk, moldy bread. These could kill just as easily, especially if given deliberately. One barkeep in Arizona was known for watering down spoiled whiskey with vinegar and selling it to out-of-towners. 3 men went blind. 1 died. When the sheriff came looking, the barkeep was gone, and so was the entire saloon. But poison was only one form of betrayal. Sometimes, the danger came from who was sitting at the table with you. You might be invited to a meal, a peace offering, a reunion, a business talk over coffee and bacon. But underneath the hospitality, there might be tension so thick you could taste it. A rancher facing off with a rival over land. A deputy meeting a man he once jailed. 2 brothers split by inheritance, chewing the same cornbread in silence, both with guns on their hips. There were customs, rules unspoken. Never sit with your back to the door. Never eat without your weapon in reach. And if a man invites you to a private dinner after dark, bring a witness, or don't go at all. One famous gunslinger, Red-Eye Pete, was gunned down at a family supper. His cousin offered him roast duck, poured him a shot of whiskey, and shot him through the chest before he finished chewing. The motive? A girl, a debt, and 20 years of bad blood. Even seemingly innocent meals could be traps. A traveling peddler might offer candy laced with opium to lull you into sleep before robbing you blind. A lonely widow might invite a stranger to supper, and when he let down his guard, her sons would drag him to the barn and take his horse, his wallet, and his boots. And then there was black salt. Used in some border towns, it was said to bring misfortune when sprinkled into a meal. Not a poison, but a curse. A cook might accidentally salt a dish twice, spit in the pot, or mutter a name while stirring, turning a simple bowl of soup into something feared. If you ate cursed food, some believed, your luck would curdle like spoiled milk. But why poison someone when you could just starve them? Outlaws captured alive were sometimes left in holding cells with nothing but stale water and a dry heel of bread. Revenge didn't always need arsenic. Sometimes it just meant letting someone waste away slowly, without comfort, without warmth. Sheriff's deputies turned blind eyes. Judges called it justice. Even in marriages, food could become punishment. A wife might stop cooking. A husband might refuse to bring home supplies. Hunger became power. Plates stayed empty. Kitchens grew cold. And yet sometimes the most dangerous meals were those cooked with love. By the wrong person. A rejected suitor slipping something special into a pie. A spurned lover making stew laced with foxglove. Stories drifted through towns about people who ate only one meal together, and never saw morning. One legend tells of a preacher who held a private dinner with a thief turned penitent. They shared bread, wine, and words of grace. But by dawn, both were dead. No one knows who poisoned whom. The note on the table read, "Forgiveness tastes bitter, but better than nothing." And yet, despite it all, people still ate together, still risked it, because even with the dangers, the betrayals, the threats hidden in gravy and smoke, meals meant connection, even if it was your last. So you watched your host, you watched their hands. You took the smallest bite first. You never finished your cup until they finished theirs. You trusted the food, but only just. Because in the Wild West, the plate could be a peace offering, or a promise of revenge. And if it was your final meal, you hoped it tasted good enough to remember, even as the world went dark. But not every strange Wild West meal ended in tragedy. Some were just odd, curious, bizarre enough to make you blink twice. We'll taste the weirdest food combinations of the frontier, from bacon-wrapped pickles and coffee-boiled eggs to gravy on pie and whiskey-soaked bread. It's going to get strange, in the best way. Gravy on pie and coffee-boiled eggs, the strangest meals people actually enjoyed. What if I told you that the Wild West was not only full of danger and dust, but also full of flavor combinations so bizarre, so unexpected, that they might just twist your tongue in your sleep? That for some cowboys and settlers, the strangest food wasn't what they had, but how they chose to eat it. Because when resources were limited and imaginations were free, the table became a stage for culinary creativity that defied logic, and sometimes taste. Let's start with a crowd pleaser: bacon-wrapped pickles. Yes, you heard that right. Some say it started with cowboys on the trail, combining the salty tang of preserved pickles with the crisp, greasy comfort of bacon. You didn't need a plate or even a fire if the bacon was pre-cooked. Wrap it tight, eat it cold. The pickle's snap cut through the fat, and for a man who'd been riding 10 hours straight, that odd combination hit just right. It was savory, sour, and made you feel alive. Then came coffee-boiled eggs. Crack a few eggs into the same pot where you brewed your morning coffee. Let them harden as the grounds swirl around them. Pull them out, steaming and stained, brown as the riverbed. They didn't taste like coffee, not exactly, but there was a bitterness in the yolk, smoky, earthy, as if the egg had lived through something. And what about gravy on pie? That's not a typo. Not meat pie, sweet pie. Imagine this: a slice of dried apple pie, tart, chewy, more leathery than flaky. Pour hot gravy over it, not because it tastes good, though some swore it did, but because it softens the crust and warms your belly in winter. Sweet meets savory. Apple meets beef drippings. It shouldn't work, but out there, it didn't have to. Let's not forget whiskey-soaked bread. A lonely man, a crust of hard bread, and a bottle of something sharp. Soak the bread in whiskey to soften it. Add sugar if you had it. Maybe a sprinkle of cinnamon. The result? A Wild West bread pudding. 1 part dessert, 1 part drinking problem. It was comfort in a cup. And if you passed out after, well, sleep came cheaper than a saloon room. Some pioneers created their own frontier fusion cuisine, blending immigrant traditions with survival instincts. German settlers in Texas were known to eat sauerkraut pancakes. Yes, fermented cabbage folded into batter and fried like flapjacks. Served with hot mustard, it was tangy, crisp, and as they said, better than bread when you've run out of flour. Then came squirrel fat tea. Not really tea, not even close. Boil squirrel scraps, bones, fat, whatever meat clung to the edges, and drink the hot broth like a tonic. Add salt if you had it. Add courage if you didn't. Some claimed it cured chills. Others said it was the only thing left when stew wasn't an option. Either way, it left your lips slick and your stomach grateful. For the boldest among them, spicy honeyed onions. Take raw onions, slice them thin, drizzle them with honey, add crushed red pepper or cayenne if you had a connection to New Orleans. This strange combo was eaten by outlaws before duels, by gamblers before big hands, by cowboys on days when thunder rolled in their chest. It cleared the sinuses, set the tongue on fire, made your eyes water. It was, in short, a reminder that you were still alive. Let's not forget potato coffee. No beans? No problem. Dry and roast thin slices of potato skin over the fire until black and brittle. Crush them, boil them, strain through a sock. Drink with grim determination. Was it good? No, but it was hot, dark, and gave the illusion of morning when real coffee ran out 2 weeks ago. And then came the Camp Surprise, a cowboy classic. The name changed from state to state, but the contents were always the same. Whatever was left. A dollop of beans, a slice of salted pork, a chopped onion, a bit of jerky, half a biscuit crumbled in, maybe some dried fruit for sweetness. Boil it all together and serve with a spoon. It tasted different every time. Sometimes terrible, sometimes magical, always edible. Children had their own strange favorites. Cold lard smeared on cornbread like butter. Sugar sandwiches. White bread with a thick layer of raw sugar between 2 slices. Dried apple jerky, where the fruit was left in the sun until it crunched like candy. Some even chewed raw pasta sticks, bought from the store in town. Hard, flavorless, but crunchy and fun. In mining towns, men poured vinegar on everything, eggs, potatoes, even beans. Why? Because after weeks of canned food, your tongue needed something sharp to remind it that flavor still existed. Vinegar became more valuable than whiskey in some camps. A bottle was a treasure, a spoonful a gift, and if you were lucky enough to live near a trader's post or a traveling show, you might just get your hands on something exotic. Pineapple slices in a tin, bright orange cheese from back east, dried figs, cinnamon sticks, even a tin of sardines in which were eaten straight from the can, warm and oily, with crackers and nothing else. People ate them with awe, reverence, even joy. Because, for all its strangeness, food in the Wild West was a patchwork of resourcefulness, culture, desperation, and desire. You ate what you had, you made what you could. And sometimes the strangest meals became the ones you remembered best, not because they were delicious, but because they were yours. A weird slice of pie with beef gravy, a crust of bread soaked in liquor, a cup of fake coffee steaming like hope. These weren't just meals, they were proof that people could adapt, that hunger breeds invention, that even in the hardest places people still reached for joy, even if joy came in the form of a whiskey-soaked biscuit. And so we end our journey through the plates, bowls, mugs, and mysteries of the Wild West saloon table. A place of nourishment, danger, ritual, laughter, poison, and surprise. If you're still with me, resting, dreaming, listening, thank you. Let this last taste linger like slow molasses. Let your breath deepen. Let the shadows settle. And remember, wherever you are tonight, someone, somewhere, once stayed alive because of a lizard on a stick and a prayer in a stew. Sleep well, traveler, and until next time, keep a warm plate and a soft light by your side. The unsung hands, cooks, bakers, and the hidden labor behind Wild West meals. What if I told you that the most important people in the Wild West saloons, the ones who truly kept the place alive, weren't the gunfighters or gamblers, but the ones you never saw, the ones bent over fire pits, sleeves rolled, hands burned, breath steady, crafting meals out of scraps and steam. because behind every plate of beans, behind every bubbling pot of stew, was someone whose name was never remembered, but whose food kept people from breaking. Let's walk through the back door. It's early. Not morning, not yet, but that blue-black hour before dawn. The cook is already awake. Maybe she's a woman with arms thick from lifting kettles, hair tied back in a kerchief, eyes half open as she reaches for flour. Maybe it's a man with one leg, scarred from a mining accident, who found peace stirring pots instead of hauling ore. Whoever they are, they move with purpose. Quiet, efficient, reverent. They begin with what's left: a heel of bacon, a cup of beans that soaked overnight, the last of the lard, water from the pump, ashes from yesterday's fire still warm enough to coax a flame. There is no recipe, only instinct, only hands that know how long to stir, how far to stretch, how much salt can hide the taste of age. The biscuits go in first, dough pressed by palm, not cutter. No time for circles. These are rough biscuits, baked on hot stones or in iron pans blackened by years. The bacon hisses soon after, and the beans bubble slow. One cook, maybe two. No talking, just the sound of morning food becoming a miracle. And as the first boots hit the saloon floor, that smell of grease and flour and something warm and real, it drifts into the lungs of men who haven't eaten since sundown, and suddenly the day doesn't feel so long. But the cook stays in the back. She doesn't pour the coffee. He doesn't get thanked. They work while the others laugh and fight and flirt over their plates. Their job is to feed, not to be seen. And yet, without them, the saloon would fall apart, because the strongest whiskey can't warm a stomach. Only stew can do that. These cooks worked with knives sharper than the sheriff's wit and fires hotter than any blacksmith's forge. They didn't complain when the flour had weevils. They didn't flinch when the onions were green or the meat turned fast. They just made it work, day after day, one meal at a time. And what about the bakers? The ones who ran little ovens behind mercantiles or out of covered wagons. They rose with the sun and kneaded in silence, fingers stiff from cold, backs bent from the night before. A loaf of bread wasn't just a side, it was a promise that something could rise in a world that often fell apart. They sold their bread for pennies, traded it for bullets, gave it to hungry children without asking names. Their bread held the frontier together. Crust by crust, slice by slice, comfort in a world that didn't offer much. There were spice peddlers, too, dusty figures with wagons full of clove and pepper and cinnamon bark wrapped in cloth. They'd sell a pinch of nutmeg for a whole day's wage, and yet people bought it. Because even one spiced cake, even one stew that tasted different, could remind someone of home. And there were coffee grinders, churning beans by hand until their arms ached, boiling it thick in big black pots, stirring sugar if they had it, whispering thanks if they didn't. You see, meals didn't come from nowhere. They came from the labor of people who rarely got a seat at the table. They fed the saloon, the sheriff, the drifter, the outlaw, the bride, and the bartender alike. Not because it made them rich, but because it was what they knew to do. And they kept doing it. Through drought, through sickness, through winters so cold the lard froze solid and summers so hot the yeast died in the bowl. They fed a town that didn't even remember their names, but the people remembered the taste. And sometimes that was enough, because that stew was hers, that cornbread was his. That biscuit, the one with the honey melted deep into its belly, came from a hand that had been cut, burned, and bruised, but still managed to make something warm. So the next time you imagine a Wild West saloon, imagine that kitchen. Imagine the apron stiff with flour, the pot that never left the fire, the breath held before a taste test, the nod when it was good enough. And maybe, just maybe, someone whispered a prayer over it before serving. Not for applause, but for peace. We'll step away from the kitchens and into the alleys to explore the underground world of midnight meals, secret snacks, and saloon after hours. The food the public never saw, and the deals made over bites in the dark. Midnight meals and backdoor bites, the secret suppers of the Wild West. What if I told you that some of the most important meals in the Wild West didn't happen at high noon or under lantern light in crowded saloons, but after hours, in silence, in shadows? That while the front doors closed and the music faded, the real business of food, of secrets and survival, began behind the curtains, behind the bar, or in the alleyway out back. Because when the town went quiet, hunger didn't. And neither did the people who had things to say or trade over a quiet plate of something hot. Let's begin just past midnight. The saloon's last drink has been poured. The piano player's gone. The girls are gone too, some upstairs, some gone home, some gone forever. The tables are sticky. The air smells like sweat, gunpowder, spilled beer, and fatigue. But if you listen closely, there's still life behind the swinging doors of the kitchen. A pot is scraped, a plate is slid across a wooden counter. Two men sit near the stove, saying nothing. They're not here for the food exactly, but they're here for what comes with it. This is a midnight meal, the kind that isn't served on menus. Salt pork stew that's been sitting since supper, thick and darker now, richer somehow. Cold cornbread broken with fingers. A jar passed between them, moonshine, or maybe just strong coffee. Doesn't matter, the food is hot, the talk is quiet, and the deals are real. Because late-night meals in the Wild West weren't just about feeding the body. They were about feeding information. A deputy might share a plate of beans with a known smuggler, listening for whispers about a shipment due to arrive. A rancher might sneak behind the brothel to eat with a rival's cook, trading gossip, learning which cattle were sick, which herds might go up for auction. A meal shared in silence could change the course of a town. Sometimes it was lovers meeting where no one could see. A barkeep and a drifter, a married man and a widow. They'd meet at the back stairs, hands trembling, passing a biscuit or a wrapped slice of pie. Nothing was said, but everything was understood. Food became the excuse. The real hunger wasn't in the belly. Other times, it was desperation that drove the moment. A girl who cleaned the floors might sneak leftover bacon to her brother waiting in the alley. A boy from the mines might trade his last coin for a cup of stew scraped from the pot's edge. No one spoke. The cook looked the other way. The hunger wasn't polite, but it was honest. And in a place where names didn't matter, kindness became currency. There were known codes for midnight food. If a biscuit was placed in the window, it meant you were welcome to come around back. If the stovepipe smoked after midnight, it meant the cook was still up and willing to feed whoever knocked twice. Sometimes people left payment in odd ways. A cleaned pistol, a handful of tobacco, a coin wrapped in fabric marked with a thumbprint instead of initials. And it wasn't just food sometimes. Medicine men from nearby camps might trade herbs or salves for a cup of warm milk. They'd sip slow, speak slower, and offer advice that the doctor in town wouldn't give. A woman with a swollen ankle, a man coughing blood, a cook with burned hands, all fixed over bites and sips under starlight and secrecy. There were stories, too, of a ghost who appeared only when stew was left overnight. A thin boy with pale eyes who sat silently and ate and was gone by dawn. Of an old soldier who traded war tales for biscuits. And a woman who served soup to a killer, knowing exactly who he was, and never said a word. Because sometimes food was about survival, and sometimes it was about forgiveness. And then there were the gamblers. They came late, always late. Not for cards this time, but for quiet. They'd take a seat in the far corner, remove their hats, and eat slow. Cold meat, dry bread, pickled onions from a jar. They weren't looking to win anymore. They were just hoping the food would ground them, that one more bite would keep the ghosts away. Some cried into their plates, some prayed. Some left money on the table and vanished before the cook returned. But always, always the food was made, no matter how tired, no matter how little was left. Because the cooks knew hunger didn't care about the hour, and in the Wild West, midnight was when the masks came off, when enemies became brothers for the length of a meal, when strangers became kin, if only until the last bite. There are ledgers found in old saloons, pages stained with grease and ash. On them are scrawled strange notes. 2 eggs, no talk. Stew for Jay, don't ask. Give him the last biscuit, I won't eat. Each one a story. Each one a moment. Each one a meal that meant something to someone. Maybe everything. Because, in the end, these secret suppers weren't about extravagance. They were about being seen, about having a plate set out when you thought you were alone, about knowing for one moment that you were still human, that you still mattered, that even in a world of bullets and boots, someone thought you deserved to eat. We'll step even further into the quiet and explore what happened when food became memory. The meals people cooked not to eat, but to remember someone they'd lost. Grief food. Ghost food. The kind that fills the soul, even if the belly stays empty. Ghost food. The meals cooked for the dead in the Wild West. What if I told you that not every meal in the Wild West was meant to be eaten? That sometimes pots were stirred and biscuits baked for mouths that no longer spoke? That in the still corners of lonely cabins and wind-bitten camps, people cooked for ghosts? Because when loss came, and it often did, there was no funeral parlor, no polished eulogy. Just a stove, a memory, and a recipe too full of sorrow to forget. Let's begin with the widow's kitchen. The fire is low. The light is gold. The air is quiet but heavy. On the table, a bowl of dough, a pot of beans, a tin of lard. She doesn't speak. Her hands know the motions. She's making his favorite, hot bread with molasses and pork fat stirred into the beans until they shine like black coffee. She won't eat it. She hasn't touched food in 2 days, but she makes it anyway, because that was his meal. And making it is how she says goodbye. Sometimes she sets a plate across from her. Sometimes she doesn't. But the scent fills the cabin, and for a moment she swears she hears his boots again, the slow creak of the door, the cough, the laugh. The meal isn't for her. It's for the memory, for the man, for the part of her that still hopes he'll walk in and say, "That smells good." And she'll answer, "It's just beans, like always." These meals for the dead took many forms. In some border towns, on the anniversary of a death, people would cook a full supper, meat, bread, a sweet if they had it, and leave it untouched overnight. It was called ghost supper, and it wasn't spoken of in town. But if you passed certain homes at dusk, you might smell roasting pork and see 2 plates on the table, one eaten, one untouched. A candle between them, a chair never pulled out. Among Mexican families, pan de muerto, bread of the dead, was baked once a year and placed on small altars with fruit and candles. The bread was soft, sweet, shaped like a cross or a skull, and sometimes decorated with sugar bones. No one touched it until dawn. It wasn't for the living. It was for those who had gone before. In native communities, especially among the Apache and Pueblo, the spirit of the dead was fed not with full meals, but with smokes, cornmeal, pinches of meat burned in fire and lifted with prayer. The idea wasn't to feed the body. but to nourish the soul, to send the scent skyward like a letter to another world. And there were cowboys, too, quiet men who, on the anniversary of a fallen friend's death, would cook 2 steaks on a skillet, pour 2 cups of coffee, and eat 1 of each. The second plate they left on a rock, on a tree stump, or on the edge of their bedroll. They didn't cry, they didn't speak, but they always cleaned the second fork, wiped it with a cloth, and packed it away just like the one they used. Because the ritual mattered. Because remembrance was survival. There are stories of trail cooks who made ghost meals on purpose, serving an extra portion into the fire each night. So the ones we've lost don't get too hungry waiting. Some did it out of habit. Others did it out of guilt. And not all meals were solemn. Sometimes people cooked ghost food to remember joy. A mother might bake a daughter's favorite pie on her birthday. Rhubarb with too much sugar, crust burned like always, and laugh as the house filled with the old smell. She might eat the whole thing. She might leave it on the windowsill. But it meant something. More than flowers ever could. Children, too, played a part. If they lost a sibling, they'd often sneak outside and leave a biscuit or apple slice in the grass. For him, they'd whisper, or for her, as the wind carried the scent across the prairie. No one told them to do it, but they understood. Because in the Wild West, where death came quick and hard, food became the language of grief. It didn't need words, just fire and patience, and hands that remembered what love used to taste like. One man, a blacksmith in Wyoming, was known to cook his late wife's stew every Sunday for 20 years. He'd sit at the table with her shawl across his shoulders and eat 1 spoonful. Just 1. Then pack the rest in jars and give them away to kids who passed by. He never remarried, but everyone knew he still cooked for someone. And in one of the few surviving journals from a saloon girl in Montana, she wrote, "I make cinnamon bread once a month for the baby I lost. I wrap it warm and leave it by the creek. I don't know if God takes it, but it helps my hands to remember." That's what ghost food was. Not superstition, not magic, but memory. Made real, made edible, a taste of the past, held gently in the present, whispered toward the future. No one wrote down these meals. There are no recipes, only stories. And perhaps, if you ever taste something that makes your chest ache, a stew that reminds you of someone long gone, or a pie that brings tears for no reason, perhaps you've stumbled onto ghost food without even knowing it. Because the dead don't always come with chills and chains. Sometimes they come back as hunger. And sometimes all they want is to be fed. We'll trade sorrow for sweetness and uncover the rare, joyful feasts that brought entire Wild West towns together. Celebrations where the tables groaned, the cakes were stacked high, and music danced in the steam rising from roast meats and fried dough. The times when food didn't just heal, it sang. When the table sang. Joyful feasts and celebrations of the Wild West. What if I told you the Wild West wasn't all grit and grief? That sometimes it burst open with joy. That in between the gunshots and the hunger, whole towns gathered not to mourn, but to celebrate. With tables so full they bowed, with laughter so loud it echoed off canyon walls, and with meals so rich in love they fed more than the body. Because when the harvest came in, when the wedding bells rang, or when a long-lost son came home from the trail, people cooked like the world was good. Let's begin at the heart of a frontier town. It's the end of summer. The sun sets slow, lazy over golden wheat. The final sheaves are stacked. The grain is safe. The people, worn, dusty, sunburnt, step from their fields and into the square, and something shifts. Laughter rises, music starts, and someone, somewhere, is already pulling loaves from the fire. This is a harvest feast, the kind that made even the weariest feel wealthy. Corn roasted in husks until the edges char. Potatoes baked in coals, then split open and flooded with butter. Beans stewed with bacon and molasses until they turned sweet. And meat, sometimes deer, sometimes pork, sometimes even bear, slow cooked in dugout pits until it falls apart with a sigh. Women bring pies stacked in baskets, apple, peach, cherry, and sometimes mincemeat, dark, strange, but beloved. Children carry jugs of cider. Old men stir pots with arms that remember better days. There's no head chef, no recipe, no invitation. You show up. You bring what you can. You eat until you can't. And it isn't quiet. Fiddles scream. Boots stomp. Firelight flickers in wide, grinning mouths. Someone sings, off-key but proud. Someone else kisses someone they've loved in secret all summer. And over all of it, the smell of fried dough rolls like a blessing. Funnel cakes, twisted crullers, sugar-dusted beignets. Not fancy, but sweet. And when sugar was rare, sweetness meant love. There were wedding feasts, too. Simpler, smaller, but no less powerful. A young couple stands under a tree, hands clasped, eyes wide. They've got nothing but each other and maybe a mule, maybe not even that. But tonight, they'll eat. The bride's aunt makes a stew that simmers 6 hours. The groom's cousin bakes bread so soft it makes the preacher weep. Someone roasts chicken. Someone else finds apples, bruised, yes, but still good, and boils them into something that smells like hope. And there's dancing. Not just the young ones. Everyone. Even the grannies with aching knees. Even the men who swore they didn't know how. Because out here, a wedding feast wasn't just for the couple. It was for everyone who needed to believe in beginnings again. There were holiday meals too, though holidays weren't always on time. Christmas might come a week late if the snow trapped the wagons. Thanksgiving might be declared because someone caught 2 turkeys in one day. But the food, the food, it mattered. Sweet potatoes mashed with sorghum syrup, hams glazed with mustard and vinegar, wild greens, biscuits so flaky they split with a sigh. If someone found chocolate, it went into a cake that disappeared before it cooled. Even the 4th of July, deep in cattle country, had its feast. Barrels of beer rolled out. Sausages snapped on grills. Kids ran with strips of beef jerky like flags. Pies cooled on windowsills. And men who hadn't smiled in months lit fireworks with the grins of boys. No one fought that night. No one lied. No one went hungry. And then there were the homecomings. A soldier returns. A drifter rides back after years gone. A miner emerges from weeks underground. They don't expect it, but it happens. A chair pulled out, a plate made, a bowl filled with the same soup their mother used to make. And suddenly the hardness in their eyes softens. Their shoulders drop. They breathe again. Because food in the Wild West didn't just say you're home. It said, we kept a place for you. Sometimes the celebrations were small. A child surviving the fever. A crop surviving the storm. A preacher who came and stayed. A baby born screaming and strong. In those moments, someone would light a fire and say, let's eat. Not because they were hungry, but because joy needs a place to live. And food gave it that place. Every feast, every shared table, every bowl passed hand to hand was proof that something could still go right. That in a land built on chance and dust, you could still count on beans, bread, and each other. There are diaries that speak of these nights. We ate till full, danced till our feet hurt, slept with smiles, forgot the war for one evening. Mrs. Connors brought her cherry pie. I haven't tasted anything like it since. I dreamed of it for years. Someone made apple fritters. I kissed her by the fire, don't even know her name, because that's what these meals were. Snapshots of joy, of humanity, of warmth in the wild. We'll sit with those who ate alone, not because they had to, but because they chose to. We'll explore the quiet, sacred act of eating in solitude under stars, beside rivers, or in silence after a long day. The peaceful plates, the slow bites, the meals that tasted like freedom, meals in solitude, the quiet freedom of eating alone in the Wild West. What if I told you that in the Wild West, some of the most meaningful meals weren't shared at crowded saloon tables or bustling feasts, but eaten in silence far from the noise, under stars so wide they swallowed thought? That some men and women didn't eat alone out of loneliness but by choice, because solitude fed a part of the soul that nothing else could? In a land ruled by noise, guns, cattle, and boots, stillness was rare. So when it came, and when food came with it, it felt sacred. Let's begin with a cowboy on the trail. He's been riding all day, dust in his teeth, sun on his back. The cattle have settled. The stars are just starting to spark across the sky, pale pinpricks in the velvet dark. He's built a small fire, not big enough to attract attention, just enough to warm a tin of beans. He doesn't speak, there's no one to speak to, but he smiles as the scent rises. He eats straight from the can, a spoon scraped clean. The fire cracks. The only other sound is the slow chewing of a man who worked for every bite. This isn't misery, it's clarity. A meal earned alone is a kind of prayer. There are no tablecloths, no music, no one asking questions. Just a man, some beans, the stars. That's how he likes it. Outlaws, too, found their peace in solitude, even if it didn't last. After a long ride, after a score, or after losing too many men, a lone rider might find a patch of tall grass, a stream, and a stump to sit on. He'd boil coffee, roast meat over a branch, and eat without looking over his shoulder for the first time in days. For one moment, he wasn't a wanted man. He was just hungry, tired, and glad for the silence. And there were women, strong, self-sufficient, fiercely private, who found power in eating alone. A schoolteacher at her desk, long after the children had gone home, unwrapping a biscuit from cloth and spreading it with jam she made herself. She chews slowly, reads by lantern light, sips tea made from wild herbs. There's no need to rush. No one is coming. And in the stillness, she tastes her own life, quiet, simple, and hers. A widow on her porch, a midwife in a barn, a traveling performer behind a tent flap. All of them knowing the comfort of a meal with no audience, no pressure, just nourishment and air. In a place where so much was shared, land, hardship, rooms, sorrow, solitude was a luxury. And food eaten in solitude became more than food. It became a small rebellion, a chance to remember who you were. There's something deeply human about eating alone in nature. The way firelight dances on your tin plate. The way wind smells of sage and dust. The way your own chewing becomes the only sound in a world gone still. Out there, a crust of bread feels sacred. A slice of jerky, dipped in coffee, becomes a delicacy. You savor every bite, not because it's fancy, but because it's yours. Even the poorest among them, a trapper, a peddler, a traveler too broke to stop at a saloon, found moments of unexpected grace in solitary meals. A rabbit caught in a snare, roasted over flame, no salt, no pepper, just fire and flesh. But the way it filled the belly, slowly, steadily, made the silence feel like a friend. And the stars above? They blinked in approval. You weren't alone, not really. The land was with you. The sky was listening. Solitary meals weren't always planned. Sometimes they happened by chance. A man separated from his group by a storm. A woman left behind when the wagon moved on. A child lost and found again. They'd sit by themselves, find something. A heel of bread, a handful of dried fruit, water from a stream, and eat. And in that moment of necessity, they'd feel something else. Peace. The realization that they could survive, even alone. Journals from the era describe these moments with surprising tenderness. Ate under the cottonwoods, felt watched by nothing, it was good. Cold biscuit and bacon rind at the edge of the canyon. Sun made my tea warm, tasted better than whiskey. Nobody to share it with, and still, it tasted like victory. Because sometimes, not sharing was the point. In a world where every bite could be a negotiation, a flirtation, a deal, or a duty, eating alone was freedom. A time to let your shoulders fall. A chance to let the food taste like food, not message. And after the meal, sometimes they laid back. Watched the sky spin, smoked a pipe, slept with a blanket tucked beneath the stars. Other times they packed the rest, walked on, and never looked back. But they remembered the meal, not because it was the best, not because it was warm, but because it belonged to them and no one else. In the Wild West, where so many things were shared without choice, food was one of the few things you could keep, even for a few minutes. Even if it was just a crust of cornbread or a cup of gritty coffee, it was yours. And in that moment, so was the silence. And in that silence, you healed. Because eating alone wasn't a tragedy. It was a return. To the body, to the earth, to yourself. We'll return to the bustling world of community and explore how food helped settle fights, seal truces, and make peace between enemies. From rival ranchers breaking bread to outlaws dining beside the lawmen who once hunted them. These were the uneasy, unforgettable meals that held the West together. Truce meals. How food settled feuds and forged peace in the Wild West. What if I told you that some of the most important agreements in the Wild West weren't written on paper or carved into stone, but sealed with a plate of stew and a cup of bitter coffee? That in a land stitched together by grudges and gunpowder, it was sometimes food, humble, warm, and shared, that kept people from tearing each other apart. Because out here, when words failed and bullets paused mid-holster, a table between enemies could speak more powerfully than a courtroom ever could. Let's begin on the edge of a cattle war. Two ranchers, land dispute, fence lines argued, water rights nearly coming to blood. For months, they've exchanged threats, not greetings. Their hired hands glare across the range like soldiers on a battlefield. And then, one of them sends a message. Come to supper. It's not a surrender. It's not an invitation to talk peace. It's a test. The rival shows up. Dust on his boots, hat in hand, gun on his belt. They don't speak at first. The wife serves stew, thick with beans and salt pork. There's cornbread on the side. The fire crackles. The tension is thicker than the gravy. They eat, and slowly things shift. Because food is grounding. It's hard to hold a grudge with hot bread in your hands. It's hard to lie with a mouthful of stew. And it's near impossible to start a shootout with your child watching from across the table, spooning beans into his mouth and looking between you both with quiet, curious eyes. So they talk. About cattle, about fences, about a well that's running dry. They don't settle everything. But when the meal is done, one of them says, "That was good," and the other nods. That's the beginning. That's the truce. And out in the Wild West, sometimes that was enough. There were other meals like this, some more dangerous. A sheriff and an outlaw, once friends, meet in the corner of a saloon over cold chicken and stale bread. no one else sits near them. They eat in silence, but their eyes never leave each other. One of them offers whiskey. The other shakes his head. By the end of the meal, the outlaw agrees to ride out by dawn. The sheriff agrees not to follow. The food becomes the peace pipe, passed, chewed, swallowed, remembered. Sometimes entire towns used food to diffuse tension. After a rough election, with bruised egos and hot tempers, a town council might organize a barbecue, a whole pig, kettles of beans, sweet cider and sour lemonade. They'd bring out tables, set them end to end, and force people to sit side by side. You couldn't curse a man with mustard on your chin. You couldn't pick a fight while holding a dripping slice of peach pie. Food softened everything. It didn't erase the wounds, but it reminded people they still shared something. Even the most feared gunslingers, the legends, they had their moments of food-forged pause. Doc Holliday once reportedly shared a midnight meal with a Pinkerton agent who had trailed him for weeks. A fried steak, 2 eggs, and coffee so thick it barely poured. No arrest followed, no shots fired, just 2 tired men chewing the same meat in the same quiet dark. Because sometimes that's all it took. A pot of soup, a shared loaf. A silent bite passed from one hand to another. It's easy to think the Wild West was only blood and grit. But behind the stories of violence are quieter moments of survival, of grace, of choosing not to kill, and often food was at the center. There were traditions passed between cultures too. Indigenous tribes who offered cornmeal or roasted rabbit to settlers during fragile ceasefires. Mexican families who welcomed nervous gringos with tamales wrapped in steam-softened husks, laying tension to rest with spice and sweetness. Chinese railroad workers who shared bowls of noodle soup with miners who'd once cursed them. Silence turning into respect with each slurp. Food transcended the borders guns drew. It gave people something to chew on, besides rage. And it wasn't just men. Women used food to stop feuds inside homes. Sisters torn apart by inheritance, reunited over a kitchen table. Mothers who invited the girl their son had betrayed to supper. No judgment, just pie and kindness. These meals weren't loud, but they lasted. They became turning points no one dared call by name. Even children knew the rules. If a boy gave you half his biscuit, it meant the fight was over. If a girl handed you her last strip of jerky, it meant she forgave you. These were unspoken pacts, as binding as handshakes, as sacred as scripture. And when apologies were too hard, food spoke for you. A man might leave a pie on a doorstep instead of knocking. A woman might deliver fresh bread to a widow whose husband she had once hated. These were the peace offerings, small, edible truths that said, "I'm trying." Because in the Wild West you couldn't always fix what was broken, but you could soften the edges with something warm. Meals became the first step toward mercy. A bite shared meant violence delayed, and sometimes that delay turned into understanding. "We still fought after," one diary reads, "but we didn't shoot, we ate stew, we listened, and the land didn't feel like it hated us for a while." That's what food did. Not erase history, but pause it. Long enough for people to remember they were human. We'll walk into the final room of the saloon, not the bar, not the kitchen, but the place where food became memory. The dying meal. The last bites of those who knew the end was near. What they asked for, what they were given, what their final tastes told us about how they wanted to leave the world. The final bite. Last meals and quiet departures in the Wild West. What if I told you that the last thing many people tasted in the Wild West wasn't blood or whiskey, but bread or beans? That in a land where death came quick and often unannounced, a surprising number of people were given, or made, one final meal before stepping off the map of the living. Because out here, the end wasn't always sudden. Sometimes it came slowly. Sometimes you saw it coming. And when you did, the question wasn't, will I live? But, what will I taste before I go? Let's start in a prison. A small, stone-walled cell near the edge of a frontier town. The man inside has been sentenced to hang at dawn. He's known it for weeks. The sheriff knocks gently on the bars and asks the same question he asks every condemned man. What do you want for your last meal? The answers vary. Some ask for steak, rare and thick, dripping with juice. Some ask for simple beans and cornbread, like their mother used to make. Others don't ask for food at all. They ask for silence, or coffee, or a cigar. One man asked for sardines on crackers and ate them with trembling hands, saying nothing. When asked why, he said, "That's what I had the day I met her." Sometimes it's not a prisoner. Sometimes it's a dying homesteader. An old woman in a rocking chair, knowing her breath is almost gone, asks for apple pie, even if the apples are dried and the sugar's low. Her daughter bakes it with shaking hands. It's not pretty. The crust cracks. But when it's served, warm and steaming, the old woman smiles and says, "This will do." Then she eats half, closes her eyes, and never wakes. That's how it happened, more often than you'd think. Not with screams or gunfire, but with slow chewing and the faint smell of cinnamon. In mining towns, men buried in cave-ins were sometimes rescued too late, still breathing, but too far gone. A few lived just long enough to eat one more thing. One miner, pulled out after 3 days, asked for broth. Just broth. He sipped it from a tin cup, said thank you, and passed before the second swallow. Another asked for whiskey and jerky. He took one bite, spat it out, laughed, and said, "Still tough as hell," before slipping away. It mattered, the last bite, even if it was small, even if it was bitter. Travelers who fell ill on the trail, a boy with fever, a mother in childbirth, an old man coughing blood, were often given the best a camp could spare. A piece of sweet bread soaked in milk, a biscuit with honey, a soft egg cracked into a bowl and stirred with salt. These weren't just meals, they were offerings. One last kindness, one last comfort. And it wasn't just for humans. There are stories, soft, half-forgotten ones, of horses given apples before being put down, of dogs fed strips of bacon before the end, of oxen who plowed their last furrow and were given a pail of oats before the rifle was raised. Because even then, in a place as hard as the West, people understood that the way you leave mattered. And what you taste last, it lingers somehow in the air after you go. In some towns, it became a quiet ritual. When a man was dying, not from crime or battle, but age, the community would bring food. One by one, neighbors would stop by with a covered dish. They didn't knock, they just left it on the porch. Fried potatoes, sweet corn, molasses cake, a slice of smoked ham, a bit of blackberry jam wrapped in cloth. It wasn't a funeral yet, it was a farewell. A soft chorus of flavors saying, "You mattered, you lived, you were fed." There's a journal from a nurse who rode the trail with the Union Army. In it, she describes a man whose stomach had been torn open by a bullet. He was calm, pale, and when she asked if there was anything he wanted, he said, "Just water and some of that bread, the one with the sugar on top." She had one slice left. She tore it in two, gave him half, and watched as he ate slowly, eyes closed. "This is good," he whispered. "I forgot how good." He died an hour later. She kept the other half in her saddlebag for weeks. It's not always dramatic, not always tragic. Sometimes it's simple. A cup of broth, a stolen orange, a crust of bread, a final sip of lukewarm coffee. But in that moment, In that last quiet moment, the world slows. The noise fades. The past and the future vanish. There's just the taste, the breath, the stillness. And for those who survive, the memory of that final meal becomes everything. He asked for cornbread, they'll say. Just one piece. She wanted stew, the kind her sister made. He ate his last bite with a smile. These aren't recipes, they're stories. And in the West, where legends are born from dust and fire, sometimes it's the small tender details that endure the longest. Because the last bite you take is also the first bite someone remembers you by.